The sun was setting as Jonathan Crane sat in his office on the top floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown New York. His world had always seemed unshakable. A corporation worth billions, tens of thousands of employees. The fame of a financial genius who knew how to turn any crisis into an opportunity. He thought he held all the cards in the world. But a phone call changed everything. "Mr. Crane?" The secretary's voice trembled. "We have a problem. A big problem." A headline from a major media outlet appeared on his computer screen. Crane's financial empire. Fraud of the century? Justice Department launches investigation. At first he couldn't believe it. It was impossible. His company had always played by the rules, at least as much as the market would allow. But the calls kept coming. Lawyers, partners, even his closest friend and co-founder of the company, Richard Hall, suddenly stopped answering. When he finally got through, Richard's voice sounded cold and distant. "John, don't call me again. This is your war, not mine." "What do you mean?" Jonathan felt an ice cold run down his spine. "We built this empire together. You know it's a lie." But the line had already been cut. At that moment, Jonathan realized he was not just being attacked. He was betrayed. The one he considered his brother had become his executioner. Outwardly, he remained composed, but inside everything was falling apart. Fear, anger, pain, they tore his heart to pieces. He looked at the panorama of the evening city, which had been his kingdom only yesterday, and thought, "Am I really no longer the master of my life? Is this the end?" His daughter, Emily, a student at a prestigious college, entered the office. Her eyes were filled with anxiety. "Dad, tell me it's not true." Jonathan wanted to hug her, to tell her that everything was fine, that he was strong and could handle it. But the words got stuck in his throat. He just sat down in a chair and covered his face with his hands. Outside the window, the night city was ablaze with lights, and he felt that the darkness was consuming him from the inside. This was the beginning of a collapse. And deep down he knew, tomorrow he would wake up a different person. A person who had lost everything except pain. At dawn, while the city still rang with the sirens of garbage trucks and the ferry was still pulling out of the river, there was a knock on Jonathan's office door. Not lawyers. Men in dark suits with Justice Department and Securities and Exchange Commission IDs passed through the glass lobby, as if through water. Search warrant. Servers were disconnected, safes were opened, phones were seized. Some employees looked away. Others wiped away the faint relief. The king's empire was crumbling, and everyone was testing whether they would survive the wreckage. "Mr. Crane, we need access to your personal laptop. You'll get everything, but explain where these accusations came from." "From your co-founder, Mr. Hall, in particular." He provided documents and internal correspondence. The words fell like a stone into water. "Richard, that's him." Jonathan, fists clenched in his pockets, reached for the password and stepped back. When the elevator doors closed behind the agents, he rested his forehead against the cold glass of the panoramic window. "I missed the obvious. I was feeding the beast, thinking it was a guard dog." The partners called one after another, not for support, but to quickly disavow. The board called an emergency meeting. The advisor spoke in a smooth tone. "For the sake of market stability, you must resign. Of your own free will," someone without a face added. He signed. His fingers trembled almost as much as on the first day in front of investors 20 years ago. But then he had a dream behind him. Now it was a vacuum. The media exploded. Selections of shots from charity banquets and sharp quotes from his interviews turned into a poisonous montage of the arrogant king. Emily did not leave the room. She turned off social networks. That evening she said quietly, "Dad, we're going to have to stay out of public view for a while. Are you ashamed of me? I'm afraid for you. And for myself too." Part of the truth began to emerge through the rustling. Fake accounts, invoices between subsidiaries, Jonathan's signature on documents he hadn't seen. The general accountant had disappeared. The lawyer had suddenly fallen ill, and Richard was giving interviews in which he called himself a witness who had no choice. In internal chats that had been made public by the media, someone under his name had discussed the transfer of assets through Marrakesh. He read and found himself wanting to believe in impersonation, in a hologram, in a conspiracy, anything to avoid admitting that the system he had built had cracks in it that people he had allowed to become his shadows had crept into. "John, make a deal. Take a deal. Save yourself and Emily. the lawyer said. Admit to procedural negligence. That's standard tactic. Admit to a lie in order to continue living a lie. The alternative is prison. At night, in an empty apartment, he opened the safe, took out an old photograph. He and Richard in the garage, among the grease, the cables, and the boyish dreams. We're going to build something that will outlive us, Richard had once said. Now that something was falling, pulling them both down, but one managed to wriggle out and put a rock on the other's neck. Officially, freezing accounts, temporarily banning them from leaving, restricting access to corporate resources. Unofficially, glances in the restaurant, whispers in the hallway, emptiness in the phone book. He had lost his reputation in a single news cycle, something he had fought his whole life against. In the evening, the final crack came. Emily, choking back tears, whispered that she was moving in with a friend for a week until things calmed down. The door closed softly, but the sound echoed in him like a gunshot in an underground parking garage. He was left alone and silent. And in that silence, he felt something inside him. That flawless, bronze idol. Crack, crumble. A simple man was left in the ruins, not knowing who else he could lose but himself. The first thing that emerged from the darkness was not hope, but habit. To take a step, to make a call, to search. He began to bring up old contacts, people he had once helped, programmers from the first team, a broker who had gone into the nonprofit sector, a security guard who wrote poetry at night. Almost everyone politely declined, until a name he had barely remembered flashed up on the screen. Layla Pack, a former forensics intern, a quiet face with smart glasses who had left after someone didn't like her questions. Mr. Crane. Her voice was even, but something hidden trembled in it. I have something to show you, but not over the phone. They met in a small coffee shop on the Brooklyn docks. Layla placed a tattered notebook and a metal-cased flash drive on the table. You didn't do what you're being cut for now. You were used as a cover. Here are the threads. 5 years ago, I found discrepancies in internal transactions between Crane Capital Global and 2 small contractors. One is an empty shell, the other is connected to the Harbor and Field Fund. Private equity. More than private. It's the money of the people who write the laws. I warned you then, CFO. In 2 weeks, I was optimized. The documents disappeared, but I'm used to making mirrors for myself. She plugged in her laptop. On the screen was a flow map. Islands, trusts, credit derivatives that shifted the blame to subprime loans. The central node was the laying company Meridian Products, the invoices signed by Jonathan Crane. The signature is yours. But the electronic key for your signatures was leaked from the internal server a week before the operations. The IP leads to Richard's office. Here are the logs. And here is the correspondence between his assistant and the lawyers at Harbor and Field. The plan: inflate the balance sheet, generate a hole, collapse the shares, buy them out for pennies through a third structure, make you a scapegoat. And not just the shares. Your wife's foundation, ex-wife. Sign memorandums of cooperation with their charitable wing. There's also a tipping point. You're not a victim of the market. You're a target. Jonathan listened and felt, for the first time in a long time, not rage but clarity burning in his chest. He wasn't sinless either. In 2008, he himself had moved money offshore to keep the company afloat. He knew how it was done. That's why he saw it. The scheme was aesthetically too impeccable to be accidental. Why are you helping? Because I was kicked out for telling the truth. And because I don't want those who rule the country to learn impunity by using people like you as props. It's dangerous, Layla. So we'll do it right. Nothing loves the world more than light. At the end of the meeting, she gave him one more thing. A letter she had received anonymously a year ago. A scan of Richard's note. When he falls, we rise. The signature was personal, the handwriting impeccably familiar. And the date that preceded all the events. Jonathan left the cafe into the cold wind of the river, smiled sharply, like a man who has finally removed a blindfold. The picture of the world had turned upside down. His wealth was not only a shield, but also a target. He no longer asked why this had happened to him. He began to ask what he should do with what he knew. And he heard the answer within himself: all or nothing. The choice seemed simple on paper and impossible in real life. The lawyer insisted on a plea deal. A minimum of years in exchange for admitting negligence. Layla advised otherwise, to bring the scheme to light in a way that could not be covered up. Jonathan hesitated between being a father who should protect his daughter and a man who should protect the truth. In the silence of the night, he recorded a video message to Emily that he did not send. I am not a saint. But if I agree to a lie now, you will grow up in a country where only the shadow will prevail. I do not want such a world for you. The plan was simple and dirty. He would use his still-living media facade, record a live interview where he would show some of the evidence. In parallel, Layla would upload the full set of documents to several independent newsrooms and NGOs with a delay, in case the interview was taken off the air. The third element was a personal conversation with Richard, which Jonathan was drawn to as much as he was repelled. You don't win with the system, the lawyer warned. I'm not playing against the system. I'm playing by the rules it has long forgotten, he replied. The studio was awash with hot light on the day of the interview. The host, known for her tough, almost brutal conversations, started with a punch. Are you a fraud? I'm a man who was made into a screen. And I brought a mirror with me. Schematics, letters, logs appeared on the screen. He called out Harbor and Field, out loud for the first time, showed the path of the signature key, a question to the senator who headed the committee. The audience must have been electrified, as were those pulling the wires behind the scenes. A minute after the broadcast, Layla received the first threatening letters, and Jonathan received an offer to fix everything in a private conversation. Sender, Richard Hall. They met in the empty underground parking lot of their first office. The smell of wet concrete and old paint took them back to a time when their treasure was hope. Now they stood like two versions of the same story. Why, Richard? Because you thought you were a company. And a company is power. Power is either taken or lost. I chose the former. You handed me over to people who would sell the country for dividends. You were the first to start bending the rules. 2008. Remember? I simply brought the game to its logical end. There is an end that has a price, and it is our lives. Richard smiled crookedly. Think about your daughter. Take the deal. Take your 10%. Hide. I'll make sure the press leaves you. You're offering mercy to an executioner? I'm offering you a path not to the grave. Jonathan clicked on the recording in his jacket pocket. He knew that Richard's confession was not a legal victory, but a moral one. I don't need you to love me. I need the world to hear what you said. Then you're dead, Richard shrugged, and walked into the shadows, where the doors of a black sedan rustled. Within an hour, the entire file and audio file had been in 3 publications, 2 foundations, and a public repository. The virus of truth was spreading, and it could no longer be stopped with a single stroke of the pen. Jonathan returned home exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, not empty. He had made a bet. All or nothing. The world doesn't change in one broadcast. It creaks, getting off track, clutches at familiar handles, looking for a way back. The investigative committees opened parallel proceedings with timid determination. The senator, who yesterday put his hand on his heart, today took a break. Harbor and Field was first threatened, then distanced himself from overly active consultants. Richard disappeared from the public sphere, but not from the game. Jonathan did not receive immediate rehabilitation. On the contrary, he was charged with renewed charges, milder but real. He could go to prison for several years. The lawyer spoke of managed defeat, Layla of inevitable pay. He stood straight in court, following the judge's every word with the gaze of a person who no longer confuses truth with profit. Have you lost something? Asked a journalist on the steps of the courthouse. The empire, yes. But perhaps for the first time he found himself. Emily returned not with tears, but with a thermos of coffee and hugs that smelled of childhood. Dad, you did something I didn't expect from you. You admitted your mistakes and didn't sell out. Even if that would have been easier. I spent a long time building a wall of success that wasn't mine. It's time to tear it down. The sentence turned out to be mixed. Several years of probation, significant fines, a ban on holding executive positions in public companies for a certain period. He paid part of the fines by selling everything that was left. The apartment was emptying, the bills were getting smaller, but the silence no longer cut into his eardrums. There was room for the voices of others. Together with Layla, he created a small initiative, a forensic education fund for students from poor neighborhoods who want to learn to see what they are hiding, so that the truth would not be an accidental heroine, Layla said at the opening. From time to time at night, that garage Richard would return to him, The guy with the eyes that shone not with money, but with dreams. He would ask himself if there had been a moment when he could have turned the wheel earlier. Could the past be redeemed? Yes, if one did not confuse redemption with oblivion. He began writing open letters to former colleagues, not lecturing, but describing how small compromises constituted great betrayal. The letters were read. Some were angered. Some were made to think. One morning, he woke up to the news. Harbor and Field had lost key investors. The investigation had gone further than expected. Richard's name was back in the headlines. Jonathan was not happy. He simply felt that the shadow of his figure on the wall had become smaller. The world was still imperfect, but a small hole had appeared in it through which light penetrated. He had last stood by the river where he had once met Layla, watching the sails of boats catch the wind. Is it possible to be rich and honest? He asked himself. You can be honest and live. And wealth, it is not built up by zeros, but by deeds. What is more important, truth or success? Truth without success is like a star without a sky. It still shines. Success without truth is like a sky without air. Beautiful until you try to breathe. Can you buy back the past? No, but you can pay in advance for a future in which others will not repeat your path. He smiled not at the cameras, not at the market, not at the judges, at himself and at his daughter standing next to him. And, perhaps, at that moment, for the first time in his life, Jonathan Crane felt truly rich.